So the next locator we are actually going to look at is getByRole. Now getByRole is also one of the most recommended locators by the Playwright. Now what is actually a role? A role is nothing but it is actually an accessibility concept, which means that when actually the page is in kind of a screen reader mode, now what is actually the purpose of a web element inside the page is basically defined by the role. So now the role actually has two ways. So it could be an implicit or it could be an explicit. Now implicit means that it is usually decided by the tag. So for example, if it is a button tag, then we know that the role is a button. If it is an anchor tag, then we know that the role is kind of link. But it could also be explicit where we could define that, okay, we wrote actually a div tag where it does something when we click on the div tag. So the role of that particular div is actually a button. So there are two ways of actually defining this. Now let's actually take a quick look into it, like how can we identify an element by role and how can we quickly get the attributes of the role. So in this case, I'm just going to inspect here and select basically the element selector in the Chrome. So this is one of the best tool which I personally use if I have to identify by role, because this clearly gives the most important informations that you need to know if you are using actually get by role. So let's select this element selector, and then when you actually browse over, move your mouse in your pages, you would be able to see some pop-ups which is coming up. And here you can always see that there is actually a section at the bottom which is saying accessibility. So there you have two things, which is basically the name and the role. So let's take this text box as an example. So if you remember in our previous video, we already actually accessed this text box with placeholder with search web elements dot dot dot. But we also have another option of actually identifying this element by role. So now let's click this. If you are actually seeing this input, you would probably not actually see that role. So this is actually the area label or more the accessibility parameters, but it is not necessary that you have to see these attributes over here. So that is why I like actually this tool which is present inside the Chrome. So now if I mouse over this text box, I can see that the role of this particular text box is actually text box and the name is search web elements dot dot dot. Now, if you are actually taking the same thing on this button, you can also see here that the role is button and then the name is create web element. Now, let's say that we have to actually identify this web element. So what we have to do is we have to remember two things. The role over here is basically the button, and then the name is create web element. So now let's go ahead actually and create this web element. So let's say that the element's name is create web element, and then let me give actually some tags, create element, and this is basically a button. And now here is where it comes. So now we are going to actually select from the drop down identify by as role. So here we can see that we have two options. We have to specify the role. We already saw from the menu that this is from the inspector that this is actually a button. And then the name is create web element. So that's it. And once you click on save, you are actually now going to identify this web element by role, where the role is button, expected to be button, and then the name is actually create web element. Now, one thing what you have to understand over here is a lot of the other locators like alternative text or label, which we have seen in the past, does not have lots of other options. But this one, role, does have few more options basically. And you can see checked, disabled, expanded, pressed, selected, included, and blah, blah, blah. So in most of the cases, you don't have to use this, but this is actually specific to a specific type of a role. For example, if this is actually checked, so then in most of the cases, this is used in the radio button or something like that. If it is pressed, in most of the cases, this is kind of used in the buttons. So, excuse me. Now, when you're using these additional options, you have to make sure that it is actually compatible with the role what you are actually giving over here. As Playwright actually throws an error if the options what you have selected over here does not match basically with the role. So that's how you create actually a web element with a role to identify it by role in tacl.